All right, so topic, how and why to be a free market radical leftist. So starting off by talking about two perspectives. One of them is free market libertarianism, by which I will understand broadly the right to dispose of your own life and property without government interference, so long as the like right of others is respected. Traditionally, two types of support, not necessarily mutually exclusive, but how they're related is a complicated question, have been offered for free market libertarianism. There's a moral basis in self-ownership, the idea that each of us is the legitimate owner of his or her own self and of what they create. And then there's the economic argument that markets, where people are free to control their own resources and make their own free agreements and trade the resources as they please, has both incentival and informational advantages. That is, it in particular advantages over government, tends to give people incentives for cooperation, whereas government tends to give people perverse incentives. And markets also can harness information, competition being a discovery process, to use a discovery procedure, to use Hayek's phrase. It makes use of information in a way that the governments can't. On the other hand, there's radical leftism. Radical leftism is marked by a concern with domination, exclusion, inequality, oppression, exploitation, hierarchy, and environmental degradation, among other things. And it tends to see capitalist society as involved with all of those things, and is pervaded by malign power structures based on class and race and gender and so on. So each of the proponents of each of these perspectives tends to be hostile to the other one. Now, there is some overlap in what they condemn. So, for example, libertarians and radical leftists usually condemn war, though there are always exceptions. And they usually condemn immigration controls, although, again, there are always exceptions. But the reasons for these judgments differ, and the way that they apply their principles differ, and there's a broad range of cases where they don't agree at all. Radical leftists, for example, tend to see free market libertarians as defenders of the rich rather than as defenders of the liberty of everybody. And each of these perspectives seems to permit what the other one forbids. Free market libertarianism seems to permit socioeconomic inequality, discrimination, hierarchical workplaces, and environmental damage, which radical leftism wants to forbid. Radical leftism seems to permit what free market libertarianism wants to forbid: coercive interference with liberty and property. Nevertheless, these two perspectives once went together. In the case of the 19th century individualist anarchists, and here are a few of them, it's Lysander Spooner, Thoreau, Baudry de Cleyre, Benjamin Tucker, Ezra and Angela Heywood, Ancenne Belgarrigue, and what's her name? Blocking on her name. Dora Marsden, and various others could be described as both free market libertarians and as radical leftists. Some of them even referred to themselves as socialists. I could have stuck Thomas Hodgkin in there, except we don't have any picture of him. And the two traditions do have some common roots. They both have an emphasis on equality of authority. They're suspicious of, they both got their start in a kind of opposition to privilege, and opposition to there being, sort of special aristocratic classes that had authority and rights that other groups didn't have. So there's a sense in which they have a common origin. Since the 19th century, free market libertarians have specialized in studying forms of oppression that are directly governmental. And radical leftists have specialized in studying forms that aren't. And I think that each of them can learn from the other. Now, the free market radical leftism that we advocate, and I say we because this isn't just me. There's a bunch of us, although we're not a huge number, but there is a group of us who take this position. What we're advocating is not a compromise between the two positions, we're not trying to water down either view to make it compatible with the other. Now, there's some people who do. I know some thinkers who, who do try to reconcile, libertarianism with, with social justice, for example, and they do it in a way that seems to be to water down both sides. And I think that they suppose that they have to water down the two to make them compatible. But that's not our view. We tend to think that the relationship is not one in which the way in which the two views modify each other is not that they water each other down or weaken each other, but they reinforce each other. That each one makes the other one more radical and more consistent. Now, this union of the two views may involve some kinds of alterations in the views, but it's not alterations that make them weaker or more watered down. It's ones that make each view into the best, most thoroughgoing version of itself. So you could say that free market libertarianism and radical leftism belong together. Each is the natural completion of the other, although given that this picture seems to involve one of them eating the other, it's not perhaps the ideal image, but there you go. Now, radical leftists tend to assume that the rhetoric of individual freedom and property rights that they hear from free market libertarians and from various other people as well is just a mask for justifying oppression based on race and gender and class. And to be fair, it often has been. That rhetoric has often been used, including used by statist politicians. But also, a number of free market libertarians have contributed to the problem by embracing racist, sexist, and classist views. And so, of course, that's going to just make the radical leftists feel confirmed in their suspicions. But a proper understanding of individual freedom and property rights, I think, supports radical leftist ideas. On the other side, free market libertarians tend to assume that the rhetoric of equality and social justice is a mask for justifying statism and collectivism. And again, to be fair, it often has been. And many radical leftists have contributed to the problem by embracing authoritarian views. But I think a proper understanding of equality and social justice supports free market libertarian ideals. Those who value radical leftist ends have reason to care about free market libertarian means, because the chief, though not the sole, but the chief enabler of the evils that radical leftists oppose is not the market, but rather the state. So I'm not saying that all the evils that radical leftists oppose are the product of the state, although I think that they are, even when they're not, I think they are both more justly and more efficiently combated by market means rather than state means. But a lot of them are either produced by or at least exacerbated by state intervention. On the other hand, those who value free market libertarian means have reason to care about radical leftist ends. Because if it's wrong to push people around by using force, it's arguably wrong to push people around at all in any way. It doesn't mean that it's a rights violation. We're not saying that the concept of that the principle of non-aggression should be expanded to include various kinds of non-force using oppression. Not saying that. What we're saying is that ways of pushing people around, oppressing them, and manipulating them that don't involve force are wrong for some, at least, of the same reasons that versions involving force are. There are some differences. Force is these special and interesting ways, but there is some commonality, and so it's reasonable. It would be odd to think that people matter so much that you should never infringe on their rights by force for any reason, but that other ways of pushing them around are just fine. That's not logically inconsistent, but it's sort of weird. So this brings us to the thick libertarianism, which is an idea that Charles Johnson and I each attribute to the other. I always thought he came up with it. He always thought I came up with it. So I guess it's something we came up with together in conversation. This is the idea that libertarians, as libertarians, must, in other words, not just libertarians in their capacity as as human beings, but libertarians considered as libertarians or qua-libertarians must embrace certain values that are either causally or conceptually connected with the non-aggression principle, even if they're not entailed by it. So there's some values that are not logically required by the non-aggression principle, but nevertheless there are reasons for people who accept the non-aggression principle to accept these as well. So one example is grounds thickness. This is the idea that there's some values that are entailed not by the non-aggression principle, but by some of the best reasons for the non-aggression principle. So a certain kind of anti-authoritarianism could be part of the reason for the non-aggression principle. And anti-authoritarianism might extend more broadly, so that it might be reasons to oppose certain kinds of hierarchical or manipulative relationships that don't involve aggression, because they're wrong on the same grounds that aggression is wrong, or some of the same grounds. And there's application thickness, which is the idea that there's some values that are needed in order to apply the non-aggression principle correctly. Take, for example, the dispute over animal rights. So non-aggression principle says you shouldn't aggress, but aggress against whom? Who are the, against which organisms should you not aggress? Is it only humans? Well, if we encountered extraterrestrial aliens that were, intelligent like us, presumably would apply to them too. So it's not just being human. So does it apply only to beings of a certain level of intelligence and moral agency, or does it apply more broadly? Does it apply to some non-human animals? If so, which ones? Well, in order to answer those questions, you're going to have to do some kind of value reasoning. You're going to have to, I'm not saying what the right answers to those questions are, but I'm saying that whatever the answers are, they're going to depend on certain kinds of values, and that you're not going to know how to apply the non-aggression principle unless you've got some kind of story that appeals to values that go beyond just non-aggression. The non-aggression principle doesn't apply itself. Another example is strategic thickness. This is the idea that there's some causal preconditions for implementing the non-aggression principle. So, for example, gross economic inequality is not by itself a violation of the non-aggression principle, but gross economic inequality might make a libertarian society difficult to achieve or to sustain, because the wealthy are in the position to influence the government, or if there is no government, they're in the best position to create one. And so they can translate their economic power into political power, even if economic power itself is not a bad thing, it can be used to create the kind of political power that libertarians think is a bad thing. Then there's consequence thickness, which is the idea that it's reasonable for libertarians to oppose things that are independently bad and that are caused by non-aggression principle violations. So take the example of sweatshops. A lot of libertarians defend sweatshops on the grounds that they are the best available option for those workers. And certainly, I don't think we should oppose sweatshops stupidly. That is, take away, it's no benefit to workers who have to work in sweatshops if you take away that option and don't provide anything else. It's like, grabbing a moldy crust of bread from a starving person and saying you shouldn't have to eat that, but not giving them anything better. That's no benefit. My philosophy department once had a head who would fire our temporary instructors whenever they got their PhDs on the grounds that PhDs shouldn't have to have crappy instructor jobs. So the idea is not to oppose sweatshops stupidly, but the idea is that sweatshops are not simply it's important to recognize they're not simply an organic result of the free market, that the conditions that create sweatshop labor are conditions in which the people who work in sweatshops are often people who have been dispossessed from resources and property that they had, or economic opportunities that they had by their own local governments. And sweatshop employers are often eager to find countries where the governments are oppressive in this way, and they are not interested in combating that oppression, because that oppression places workers in situations of desperation, so they're willing to put up with with dangerous, unsafe, and humiliating working conditions. And so just saying that sweatshops are the best option for a lot of workers, well, it's true, is missing an important part of the picture. So the idea here is that libertarians should see their struggle against the state as part of a unified struggle against the very same things that radical leftism sees itself as struggling against: patriarchy, white supremacy, heterosexism, bossism, environmental waste, and so forth. And in many ways, this is a return to libertarianism's 19th century roots. In the 19th century, a lot of libertarians were what we would think of as being on the radical left. So this brings me to the concept of free market anti-capitalism, which sounds like an oxymoron to a lot of people. But think about it this way: both defenders and opponents of modern capitalist society tend to assume first that our society is some kind of a rough approximation to a free market. And then, as a result, second, that the socioeconomic inequality and corporate power that prevail in our society are primarily the result of a free market. And we just disagree about whether to embrace that package deal or reject it. But from the free market anti-capitalist position, this is a conflation of corporatism or cronyism. You could say that's the rule of a big business, big government partnership with free markets. And this conflation comes in two flavors. So there's left conflationism. This is one that treats the evils of present-day corporatism or cronyism as a reason to reject free markets. And there's right conflationism, which treats the virtues of free markets as a reason to defend the results of present-day corporatism or cronyism. So in other words, both sides accept the package deal. They just they accept the description of the options. They just think that one thinks that they accept this package deal of the apparently good thing and the apparently bad thing being glued together, and one just thinks that the good thing is good enough reason to swallow the bad thing. Another one thinks that the bad thing is bad enough reason to reject the good thing. Whereas free market anti-capitalism wants to challenge that. And wants to challenge it more radically than a lot of libertarians do. A lot of libertarians will say, in fact, a lot of radical leftists will say, oh, well, strictly speaking, what we have is not a free market. So you'll often see libertarians saying, well, of course, this isn't really a free market. And then they'll immediately slide back into defending something or other on the grounds that, well, this arises on a free market, as though they've forgotten that they've just been saying it wasn't. But radical leftists do the same thing. They'll often say, well, of course, what we have now is not a real free market. But then they'll go on to condemn something or other as a free market thing, on the assumption that it arose through free market means. So I think that although this is a concession that both sides often make in principle, I think that they both have a tendency to lose sight of it. Now, historically, the term capitalism referred to a system favoring employers, capital in that sense. The word capital has a lot of meanings. In this sense, employers, the people who provide the capital, the equipment, against workers, against labor, against employees. More specifically, it meant a system in which ownership of the means of production is concentrated in the hands of an employing class. That so traditionally, the traditional meaning of capitalism, which so a lot of libertarians just think capitalism means free market. But if you look at sort of the history of the way the term was used, and the way a lot of people still use it, in fact, this is the official Marxist meaning, is that it's a system in which ownership of the means of production is concentrated in the hands of an employing class. Of course, Marxists, will say that and then forget it. But that is the official definition. So officially Marxism holds that free market is conceptually that a free market without capitalism is possible, and indeed they think it's happened sometimes in history. The difference is that they think a free market is unstable and naturally will lead to this kind of concentration. Um, although Marx himself recognized that it hadn't done so, that this concentration of ownership had arisen through violent intervention in the market by force that dispossessed people from their lands and gave them no option except to work for the capitalists. Marx recognized that, but Marxists gradually retreated from that view to the view that not merely the view that the free market, if there were one, necessarily would morph into capitalism in the sense, but that's what actually happened. So if you read something like The ABC of Communism by Bukharin and Preobrazhensky, or if you read some of Engels' later writings, they've sort of forgotten about Marx's actual account historically of what happened. Anyway, so nowadays, a lot of people use the term conflationistically, if that's a word, to mean something like the free market system we have now. Of course, if we don't currently have a free market, then it's not clear what that actually means. And so it's the very use of the term is a kind of package deal. So I think that's some reason that libertarians should stop using the term capitalism to refer to a genuinely freed market. And some of us use freed rather than free to emphasize that a free market is something that has to be achieved. It's not something that currently exists. So the fact that capitalism traditionally referred to this kind of concentration of ownership, and the fact that free market is often used conflationistically to mean, the system now being described as a free market, I think those are reasons not to use the term capitalism. Although some left libertarians do, and that's fine. I don't want disputes over terminology to be the big thing here, but I'm inclined to resist it. Now, some left libertarians go so far as to say that we should readopt the term socialism the way that some of the 19th century individualist anarchists did. But from my point of view, socialism has got too much unpleasant baggage of its own. I think the term has sort of been ruined by the history of actual socialist regimes. So I'm not inclined to use the term socialism either. But I don't have a quarrel with if you want to call themselves a free market socialist and they want to explain what they mean by that. I'm not going to fight them over that. But anyway, for myself, I prefer not to use either term to describe my views. So there's a dynamic that I call right cop, left cop, which is based, it's sort of inspired by the of good cop, bad cop, which is where one cop will, one police officer will. I don't know whether that's a phrase that's familiar to you. So, good cop, bad cop is the idea that two police officers who are interrogating you will cooperate with each other in the way that one of them will pretend to be the hardline one who's threatening you, and the other one will pretend to be the nice one, saying, that guy's a real hard ass. I'm on your side, but I want to protect you against that guy. But if you cooperate with me, I can prevent you from being subject to whatever that guy wants to do to you. When in fact, of course, they're just working together. So that's what good cop, bad cop means. And so I came up with the phrase right cop, left cop as a way of capturing a similar dynamic. So conservatives often pose as critics of big government, and liberals often pose as critics of big business. But in fact, since big government and big business, as we see it, are largely in cahoots with each other, the result of this is that those who oppose one wing of the ruling government-business partnership just get lured into supporting the other, and their genuine libertarian alternative is rendered invisible. So I like making this analogy to the Star Wars prequels, that just like church and state in the Middle Ages, government and business each want to be the dominant partner, just as in the Star Wars sequels. Palpatine and the Senate represent the government, whereas Count Dooku was allied with the Trade Federation and a bunch of commercial interests, and they appear to be at odds, but in fact they're cooperating the whole time. Now, in that movie, although they were secretly cooperating, each one tried to betray the other one. Each one wanted to be the dominant partner. Just as church and state, each of them wanted to be the dominant partner in the Middle Ages, but nevertheless, they had an interest in cooperating to hold people down. Now, I'm not saying this always works as a conspiracy theory, that that business and government are, politicians and corporate leaders are secretly getting together and plotting these things, although I'm not sure that never happens. But a lot of it just happens sort of the automatic alignment of interests. There's just a natural tendency for these interests to align in that way. So in fact, as we see it, markets do not tend to promote gross economic inequality. They'll promote, some economic inequality, but if you have massive, systematic, long-lasting socioeconomic inequality, that's usually a sign that some kind of government intervention is involved, because markets tend to be a leveling force. If people are allowed to imitate what successful people are doing by competing with them, then successful people's advantage is going to be only temporary. One of the things that economic regulations, including those that are marketed as being to protect the less affluent from the more affluent, a lot of these regulations actually have the effect of insulating dominant firms from market feedback, making them islands of centrally planned chaos. So competition would render firms smaller and less hierarchical, we think. There would be more workers' cooperatives and independent contractors. That doesn't mean that there would be no such thing as employer-employee setups. I know that a lot of radical left anarchists have this view that employment and wage labor as such are illegitimate. That's not the view of most of us, but rather we think that if some of the obstacles to alternatives to wage labor were removed, then wage labor would have to compete with other kinds of options, and that would mean that employees would have more control over the conditions of their employment. They would be in a better bargaining position and so forth, and so that wage labor would be less hierarchical and oppressive than it is nowadays. Now, the whole idea of a class struggle against the ruling class, was developed by libertarians or classical liberals who were either anarchists or near anarchists in some cases. So, for example, in France, you have Charles Comte, Charles Dunoyer, and Augustin Thierry. And Dunoyer and Thierry were awfully close to being anarchists anyway. Comte maybe less so. By the way, it's not the famous Auguste Comte. This is a different Comte. I'm not even sure they're related. In fact, I think they're probably not, because when John Stuart Mill wrote a letter to one of them, he referred to the other one as your homonym rather than, for example, your cousin. So at least he doesn't seem to have thought they were related. Anyway, they developed a theory of class. Thomas Hodgkin in England was an anarchist. James Mill was not. But anyway, all those guys developed theories of class struggle. The pictures here are of Thierry, Dunoyer, and Mill, James Mill, father of John Stuart, since those are the only ones that we have pictures of. I don't think we have any image of Charles Comte, and I mentioned before, I don't think we have an image of Hodgkin. And Marx, this is my favorite picture of Marx. It's like one of the least favorite pictures of Marx, but it's Marx when he was young and less rigid, and his beard wasn't quite as much of a massive tangle. Marx said, "No credit is due to me for discovering the existence of classes in modern society or the struggle between them. Long before me, bourgeois historians had described the historical development of this class struggle." He mentions, for example, Thierry. Then he goes on to say false things about what they had said, but anyway, he recognized that that theories of class struggle were originally a free market view. Now, in Marx's version of class theory, what determines whether someone is a ruled or a ruling class is differential access to the means of production. It's the ruling classes are those who have access to the means of production, and they are able then to translate that into political power. And the ruled classes are the ones who are excluded from the means of production. Now, in the libertarian version of class theory, it's sort of the other way around, although obviously there's a kind of a two-way street here, but in terms of emphasis, the libertarian view is that differential access to the means of production is primarily the product, not the cause, of differential access to state privilege. Now again, of course, there's a feedback loop here, because once you do have greater concentration of wealth, you're better able to influence political institutions in such a way as to get even more. But nevertheless, the libertarian version is that the main way that that these come about is not through market competition, but through state privilege, which, as I mentioned, was Marx's own view in his historical writings, but he often tends to forget it when he's passing from historical analysis to political rhetoric, and his followers really forget it. Now, the libertarian defense of private property doesn't, or anyway shouldn't, mean defense of all existing property arrangements, because it depends how they arose. The present and how they're maintained. The present distribution of property both arose by and is maintained by systematic state interference with the market, with libertarian property rights. So here's some examples. So as a firm grows larger, it takes advantage of economies of scale. There are gains in efficiency from having a larger size. But there are also diseconomies of scale. There are ways in which becoming larger makes a firm more efficient. There are other ways in which it becomes less efficient. So it's more efficient in that, for example, if there are two firms and each has take a very simplistic example. If there are two firms and each has a photocopier room, and one has a photocopier room with two photocopiers, and the other has another photocopier room with two photocopiers, the main one and the backup. If the two firms merge, maybe they only need 3 photocopiers instead of 4. So having a larger firm has efficiencies, but there are inefficiencies too, inefficiencies from getting larger, and a lot of them are the same kinds of inefficiencies that come from socialist central planning. The larger an organization is, the harder it is for the managers to know what's going on, or know or to understand exactly what's happening, or know when there's when there's a problem, which of their thousands and thousands of employees is responsible for it. It's much harder to tell because the internal structure of the firm is disconnected from the market. And also there are instantival problems with large hierarchical organizations. Information doesn't travel well in hierarchies. Subordinates are often reluctant to tell the whole truth to their bosses, because the bosses often get mad and punish the bearer of bad news. And so as a firm goes larger, at some point the diseconomies will overtake the economies. And here I'm drawing a lot on ideas from Kevin Carson, someone that has developed a lot of important ideas for this tradition. I don't agree with him on everything, but then I don't think any of us agree with each other on everything. He's probably a bit farther from traditional free market libertarianism than I am, but I think he's made some useful analysis here. Now, in a free market, firms that grow past the efficiency point, past the point where economies of scale outweigh diseconomies of scale, will be weeded up in competition, unless there's some government-granted privilege that can immunize them from competition. And that will enable them to pocket the benefits of the economies of scale, while the costs of the diseconomies they socialize by someone getting government and thereby the taxpayers or other firms or something like that to pick up the tab. Some examples, I'll just go through them very quickly. We can talk about them more in Q&A if you want. There are various kinds of subsidies, both direct and indirect, that large firms get from government. There are bailouts they get, protectionist tariffs, eminent domain, where private land is seized and given, seized from private owners, and they're paid, but they paid some price less than they would have paid voluntarily, and given to private corporations. Then there are licensing and zoning and other regulatory restrictions that hurt small startups more than large established firms, because large established firms can hire lawyers and lobbyists and people to influence these regulations, or at least to understand them and jump through all the regulatory hoops, whereas small businesses have a much harder time following all that stuff, and therefore they're at a systematic disadvantage of the kind that they would not be at nearly so much a disadvantage in the free market, in a genuine free market. Also, if a firm increases its size, that leads to its being more productive in many cases, but that creates a need to distribute products over a wider area, and that in turn leads to higher distribution costs. So increasing firm size to get greater productivity is not costless. But if a firm can get someone else to foot at least part of the bill for its higher distribution costs, then it can take advantage of the benefits of greater productivity without having to pay the cost of those higher distribution costs. So an example is highway subsidies. Most of the long distance shipping, most of the wear and tear on highways is caused by long distance shipping rather than just by private family vehicles. But the big shipping companies that cause that wear and tear don't pay a proportional amount of the tax funding for the highways. So highway subsidies, in effect, represent a redistribution from ordinary people to big corporations. They are subsidizing the transportation and thus the distribution costs, so that the firms can get the benefit of this increased productivity, while fobbing the distribution costs onto the taxpayers. Another example is that transactions between firms are taxed, and transactions within firms aren't. If I want to get some copying done and I go to a local photocopying shop, there's a sales tax. If I just got a photocopying department within my firm and I send the stuff down there, it's not taxed. So that gives an incentive to move operations in-house, and that's another way in which smaller firms are penalized at the expense of larger firms. Then, of course, when you consider inflation and the way that inflation is fueled by monetary expansion, favored firms will receive the new money first, while still facing the old lower prices, whereas little people face the new higher prices before getting the new money, and so they fall systematically behind. Another example is quality standards. So quality standards might seem like a good thing. Require that that various products and services on the market meet a certain minimum quality standard. Seems like something wise and benevolent, instituted by government to protect people's interest, to protect the interests of ordinary people. But whatever their intentions, and there's some reason to suspect their intentions, because it often turns out that a lot of these regulations were actually lobbied for by the firms being regulated, which is some reason then to look at them with suspicion. But anyway, even if we assume that they were motivated by the most virtuous motives, the actual practice is that it works as a kind of implicit cartelization. The larger, wealthier, more established firms can afford to produce these high quality standards. Smaller firms can't afford to produce those high quality ones. Previously they were competing with them by offering consumers the option of deciding how to trade off quality versus price. Saying, all right, our products may not be as high quality, but they're a lot cheaper. Decide for yourself whether you want to buy our lower quality products or go to their higher quality products. If you forbid people to offer lower quality products, but they can't afford to offer the higher quality ones, and you're just pricing them out of competition, and then you've implicitly cartelized the market by giving a kind of oligopoly to the more wealthy and established firms. Another example is copyrights and patents, intellectual property. These rule aspects of service off limits to competition. You're not allowed to compete with another successful firm by doing what they did if what they did has been copyrighted or patented, and that tends to cement their their market share and their domination and their concentration of wealth. Some other familiar examples: deposit insurance encourages banks to make risky investments, and liability caps encourage oil companies to drill in risky ways. We had that here a few years ago when British Petroleum was caused that massive oil spill in the Gulf of Mexico, which is right near where I am, and one of the reasons that they did that was the cap. American-style healthcare, both the Republican version and the Democrat version. There are some interesting differences between them. It's mostly just sort of jockeying between different factions of the one class. They both are forms of corporate welfare. The Democratic version, like the kind of healthcare law that President Obama got passed, requiring individuals to purchase private insurance, is basically a giveaway to the private insurance companies. Now, he didn't do it in quite the way that they wanted, and so a lot of disputes that look like disputes over principle are really disputes about the details about exactly how to slice up the loot. But it was definitely more of a benefit to the corporate elite than to ordinary people. Then, of course, government enforces land titles not based on homesteading. In the United States, most of the land west of the Mississippi is owned either by the federal government or by state governments, or by land companies that have a state-granted monopoly. Now, admittedly, a lot of that land is kind of crappy in the sense that there's very little water on it, but still, people are not allowed to homestead it, and if people are not allowed to try and develop it. And obviously, we know it's possible to build thriving communities in the desert because it's been done, but people aren't allowed to do it. A lot of that land is just held out of development. And it's not all arid desert land. It's not all national parks either. A lot of it's just stuff that the government controls. In fact, the government often in the forests that it owns will give logging companies the right to go and cut down lumber at lower than the market rate. So there's no environmentalist justification for that, and there's no private property justification for that because the government has no legitimate claim to that land. It's neither on environmental grounds nor on free market grounds is it justified, but it's just another example of cronyism. Large hierarchical firms have greater trouble determining employee productivity. So, libertarians like to say that an employee is paid according to how productive they are. But the larger the firm is, and the more hierarchical the firm is, the harder it is for employers to determine, how much of their profit or loss is determined by any particular employee. But because and that, of course, would make it harder for them to make decisions. They are in the same kind of internal calculational chaos that a central state planning board is in to some extent. But if they're insulated from competition, they can avoid the cost that brings. That actually ends up subsidizing discrimination on grounds of race and sex and so on. Because if I'm the employer and I have a suspicion that the unproductive employees are the ones that are, the women or the blacks or whatever, and there's no market feedback to correct me, and so I just fire people or promote or don't promote people on the basis of my judgments about their productivity. My judgments of productivity are not the result of market feedback, but just of my own prejudices. If I'm insulated from competition by a lot of these laws, then my prejudices don't get corrected, and I don't bear the cost of making the poor decisions. Another example is labor laws. One difference between free-market libertarians and radical leftists is what they tend to think about unions. But from the left libertarian perspective, one of the effective labor laws is to tame unions by diverting them from their traditional goal of worker empowerment into being junior partners of the government-business partnership, just bargaining for higher wages rather than for worker empowerment. And unions that try to bypass that co-opting are penalized. Also, there are all kinds of regulatory restrictions on mutual aid, including even things like restrictions on feeding the homeless. If you're feeding homeless people, you can be arrested. I guess on the same grounds that you don't want instructors having these crappy. You don't want instructors with PhDs to have these crappy temporary jobs, so you fire them. So likewise, you don't want to have the homeless people be fed, some food that hasn't been government regulated and approved, and so you take the food away from them. You don't give them anything else. It's like, oh, you shouldn't have a crappy crutch like that. I'll take it away. Yeah. There are lots of restrictions on starting small firms. Often you have to have huge capitalization requirements. The amount of money you have to have to start a firm is often out of proportion to what is required. There are businesses, like for example in America in the inner cities, there are hair braiding businesses that are basically just all they do is hair braiding. But there are laws that say that you cannot have a hair braiding business unless you take a course on hairdressing in general, where you have to learn a whole bunch of things you're not ever planning to do. And of course, this costs money, and there's a license and a fee, and it's all regulated by the government. I don't know if this is still true, but for a while in Louisiana, you had to have a license in order to arrange flowers, because we all know what havoc unlicensed flower arranging can lead to. And there were tests you had to pass in order to get the license, and people found it really hard to pass these tests. It was really, really difficult to pass the tests. The tests were given and graded by the existing flower manufacturers. So you can see the cronyism at work there. Plus, the artificial scarcity caused by resource monopoly, the way in which resources and land and capital equipment are artificially concentrated in the hands of a small number of people, force people to work for employers. And so it creates an employer's market. It's easy for employers to provide crappy working conditions and humiliating working conditions because the alternatives have been suppressed or made much fewer by government. So you can see that the left's complaints about wage slavery are right, but they're directing their charge in the wrong direction. The problem is not the free market. They're right that it's unjust that there's this division of society into two classes, one of which has to work for the other. But that's not a natural result of the free market. Free market is the cure, not the cause for that condition. So where do we go from here? Well, the ruling powers in society, both the governmental and the corporate, which we see as in cooperation with each other, although not always happy cooperation. Each one wants to be the dominant partner, but still cooperation. They're too much outnumbered by the people they rule to be the sources of social order they claim to be. Just as just as governments like to claim that they're the source of all social order, so corporate bosses like to claim that they're the source of all the order in a firm. And yet, just as a society can do perfectly well if the president goes on an extended vacation, but can't do well if the garbage collectors go on an extended vacation. So likewise, if the CEO of a firm goes on an extended vacation, that's not nearly as much as a disaster as if the secretaries go on an extended vacation. They've exaggerated their claims of social order, and they're vastly outnumbered in ways that show that they are not really able to impose this power over themselves. So it means that petitioning the state or seizing control of the state, whether by electoral means or revolutionary means, so those are the usual methods for trying to achieve reform, those are not necessary as a means. You can bypass the state. So we see the path to a free society as a combination of education, direct bottom-up grassroots action, and building alternative institutions to bypass the state and to win people's allegiance away from the state to these institutions. And once enough people are just ignoring the state and ignoring the corporate power and just working in these free networks, at that point the ruling class just becomes like a bunch of crazy people yelling on a street corner, telling us what to do, and we just ignore them. I mean, their power only comes from the fact that people obey them. And so we abolish the ruling elite merely by ceasing to support them. So a few notes of where to learn more. There's the website of the Alliance of the Libertarian Left. Now currently it's a bit out of date. The person in charge of maintaining that has not really kept it up to date. That person is me. I've not, so it's not really up to date, but still there's some useful information on there. There are some books. There's Markets Not Capitalism, which you can find as a free PDF online. And there's a similarly titled Free Markets and Capitalism, which is not a free PDF online, but most of the articles in it you can find online. And I think the book itself is pretty cheap if you want to hunt it down. There's also Anarchy and Legal Order by Gary Chartier, which is available as a free PDF online. There's The Dialectics of Liberty, which is not. But anyway, those are just those are four books that and there are many others, but those are four books that outline some of these ideas. And then there's the Center for a Stateless Society, which is connected with my outfit, the Molinari Institute. It's in the eyes of the state, we're the same organization. In fact, it's more autonomous. It's like an autonomous extension of the Molinari Institute. But anyway, you can see their website. The theorists on there all disagree with each other about various things. So don't read one article and think that you thereby know what everyone on the in the group thinks. There's a lot of diversity, and some of the books I mentioned you could get through the store. As for the ones that are free PDFs, if you want to know how to find them, just email me and I'll tell you. And that's it. That's my presentation.